Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming online on this weekday, and especially considering that it's August, right? So it's still the season of vacations and kind of taking some recharge, and maybe the last kind of better days for those of us who are located into their, geographically less favorable areas, right? So because now I'm in Denmark, and today it seems to be that it's the last good day. So starting tomorrow, the rain will come back. The temperature will go down to 19 degrees, right? So what is it, Fahrenheit? 19, so probably like high 60s, right? So something like this, right? So, and it's going to be clouds and raining. Now, I hope that you have better weather than that. And that means that thank you for showing up for this late webinar. And of course, as always, there's going to be a recording, and well, we encourage you to get the questions and the feedback and whatever, all the other things. But, in case you have to get to interrupt your viewing and so on, so of course the recording will be there. So today we have an important thing, the important coverage, the uh, differences and similarities between the developmental consequences and the developmental difficulties of the so-called rare genetic disorders and or genetic conditions and the uh, sort of more standard things such as the uh, outcomes related to the brain injury, so namely the cerebral palsy. So I have last year I have recorded that video in Finland. I must say that I was kind of quite slow to start. It was very slow beginning, so that's why I asked Manuel to get that video slightly accelerated. So it might be slight mismatch when you look at the way how I write and how I talk. So that's caused by that. So I didn't want to drag people through my kind of slurry. Well, let's start. So today we try to be more energetic and also, like try to get maybe some easier summaries of these points, and then we proceed to the usual part, the questions and answers, which are going to be broad, right? As always, we prioritize and welcome the questions that specifically related to the topic of today's webinar. But then, of course, all kinds of usual Q&A related to the rehabilitation process are welcome, and I will try to answer them extensively. So that's the preamble. Now let's move on. So I will start with the, like so far we have this question in the question and answers. Our son is diagnosed with STXBP1 genetical background. It has the following symptoms: movement difficulties, intellectual disability, and epilepsy. So does ABR cover everything? What can help in his case according to the symptoms except epilepsy? So, such a really, I hate to say that, but such a standard question, right? So it's like every case is unique in that sense. Every life is unique. Every personal set of circumstances is unique. But that's a kind of question that we receive very, very often. And that's really the entire idea behind this webinar, to help you to sort of navigate this uh, complex reality in a more straightforward way. So, when I was preparing for this webinar, I bumped into this wonderful article from which I actually extracted this background. And I think that it's a good thing to start the screen sharing with it, so that just kind of to get the feel what Mr. Google tells us when it comes to the rare genetic disorders and what overall happens. Okay, look, so this is the infographics, right? So you see, and this infographics kind of connects the two main facts. 83% of all rare genetic diseases affect the child, and that's kind of signified here by the classic image of the chromosomes, and 89.6, or let's say 90% of childhood rare diseases compromise the central nervous system. So effectively, that would be this neurological component, which to a certain extent present in all of them, right? So that's the statistics that we have there to begin with. And if we go further here, so what we're going to see, this is their description. That's a very nice and actually smart article, so which is called Rare Genetic Diseases, Nature's Experiments on Human Development. And this is a very good point here, actually, saying that rare genetic diseases are the result of a continuous genetic screen that nature is conducting on humans. In other words, putting it sort of simpler, the mutations in human population has been happening like forever. And if you follow the tenets of the evolutionary theory, so this kind of micro mutations in our DNA, that's the source of our diversity, right? So you see, that's basically the pool from which the natural selection kind of draws the new options and opportunities. And of course, it works on a very large scale, right? So like thousands, tens of thousands of years, hundreds and even thousands of generations. But that's the general principle, right? So the whole idea that is explained by the theory of evolution, that genetic mutations emerge spontaneously, and then there is selection, natural selection, right? So the ones which are improving their natural fitness to the specific environment gets supported and kind of integrated into the human genome, and those ones which are not favorable to their kind of survival and natural fitness, right? So those are normally, typically, under the biological evolution, they are the ones which are excluded, right? So that's really the bigger picture. And of course, that also highlights the fact that we live in a very, very special time. Because, you know, if you look at it that way, the reality is that for whatever the entire history of mankind, or actually of human species, and for the mankind, if we talk about the mankind from the days of like early humans, so like with the social development, these individuals didn't survive. So that's the reality that we have to take on board, right? So that normally the reality is that these are the individuals who would be the victims of natural selection. And then for many, many generations, these would be the children who would be the victims of social selection as well. So that's where we are, right? Why is it important? Because it's important to understand, once you understand this, so basically it tells that there is just like out of thousands of generations, there's just at most, we have 3 generations where these children more or less reliably survive and become the sort of accepted in the society as the individuals, as persons, the ones we have to care for, the ones we have to try to help as much as possible, and so on, as opposed to being seen as kind of genetic or whatever the byproduct which has to be like eliminated. So that's the reality, how the entire history went. And you also have to understand that these are the traces of this we still see in the entire approaches to medical classification, interpretations, rehabilitations, and so on. So you have to understand that you are not really standing on the long history of successes, that you, each of you, an individual parent, you are very much being a pioneer. You are being like on the front lines of the unknown. So at first, this might sound like, oi, I didn't ask to be, I'm a simple person, I'm just a mother, or I'm just a father, I'm just a grandmother, or whatever, right? I didn't ask this kind of heroics, but the reality, that's where we are. And it's important to understand, because that also explains to a great extent why there are no really good solutions. And when you're trying to look for, like whatever is being offered by the medical system, social system, rehabilitation system, and so on, those are like realistically very poor solutions. They don't really offer much. And the reality is, guys, that's where, being at the frontier, being the pioneer, you are in a position where a lot of decision making comes from you, like your personal decision making, when you scratch your head, when you make your decisions, when you have to kind of trust whatever your, whether it's your intelligence, whether it's your gut feeling, whether it's whatever else. So that kind of based on this incomplete information, you have to make the decisions. So that's the first thing to recognize. There are no good recipes, there are no good solutions. And in that sense, we are in that discovering mode. We are in the mode of those pioneers. So that's a very important clarification that we all have to be fully aware of. So, and what you see here is that the next phrase here is that we contend that the expanding catalog of mutations in nearly 4,000 genes, which cause nearly 6,500 diseases with their described phenotypes. So that offers a wide landscape for discovering fundamental mechanisms required for human development and involved in common diseases. So, and here they were saying that rare afflictions, rare disorders, disproportionately affect the nervous system in children. But paradoxically, okay, let's skip this, right? So, for us, the practical side, thousands of genes, thousands of diseases. Now, when I was talking about the 3 generations, that's kind of one story. But if we go further and kind of look at the current situation, in fact, the big boost to this entire field came just 20 years ago. I don't know whether you are old enough to remember it, but in the year 2000, there were 2 big deals, right? Okay, like 3. One was generally the celebration of the millennium, which was actually 1 year earlier, right? So you see, because technically the year 2000 still belongs to the previous century. So, but that's kind of the nerdish person in me, right? So like my love for numbers. So this says, well, that was wrong. But anyway, so that's the first part. The second thing, everybody was scared of this kind of the problem of 2000, that computers were supposed to stop because of this mistake with the accumulated, just with 2 digits instead of 4. So that was another scare, which fortunately didn't materialize. And the third thing that happened in the year 2000 was their human genome project, more or less almost coming to completion. I think the final publications went into something like 2003, but the full deciphering of the human genome happened just 20 years ago. So that's a very important thing to understand. So in that respect, all of those new labels that you receive, they very much reflect not even the 3 generations, but actually the first generation. So, and if you look here, so that's another page that I'm sharing here. So that's the website of American government, right? So the rarediseases.info.nih.gov, right? And here, basically, well, once you know there are 6,500 of them, that's the entire alphabet, right? And then after that, we go through the list of the chromosomes, and then we go on, we go on, we go on, we go on, we go on. And of course, they all have some sort of names, right? Some of them, thanks to the tradition, are named after the discoverers, like this, some Rosay-Dorfman disease, right? Some of them are labeled according to the location, say reticular dysgenesis, right? So, and then you go again, Townes-Brocks syndrome. So basically, you can see that this list goes on and 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 on. So, and the main point is that when we look at the second infographic, which is behind my back, so that's the one that tells you what we need to know. So it tells us this basic thing. So rare disease describes a group of genetic disorders whose prevalence is up to 5 cases per 10,000. So which is actually quite a lot for a rare disease. And if you look, if I kind of summarize the stories which I hear most often from the parents, it's things like this. Well, our total Facebook group is 500 people worldwide, right? Or maybe 2,000 people, which is actually a big one. And there are plenty of cases when you just get this, like, okay, there are 5 of us in Spain, or 2 of us in Holland, or something like this, right? Or like 20 of us in the United States. So which doesn't really mean that that's exactly the number, because these things kind of being continuously reevaluated and readjusted. But that's the thing that you have to understand about this kind of the whole big picture approach. So the big picture scenario about the whole thing. So that's rare diseases. So what does it mean? That means that there is no way, there is no way to realistically get the good statistics about this for in any kind of observable or accountable lifetime. So statistics at this point is very weak, very arbitrary, and it's not going to be of much help, right? So you see, the only conditions which are more or less well sort of known and well explored, and there is more or less reliable statistics there. So what those would be the older conditions, right? So you see, and that's kind of the big 3 probably. So that would be the Down syndrome, Rett syndrome, and to a certain extent, the cystic fibrosis. So, which is also the genetic thing. Of course, cystic fibrosis very often doesn't come with the, with the developmental disorder per se, right? So with the neurological, let's say, challenges. But these are the ones which are more well known in that sense. So, and the reality is that even when it comes to the more well-known conditions, such as the ones like Down and Rett syndrome, there is not much to sort of brag about when it comes to the standard means of rehabilitation. So, of course, especially in the world of Down syndrome, you kind of have a certain number of sort of kind of heartwarming stories about the child's adaptation and so on. But when it comes to Rett syndrome and so on, really, the rehabilitation outcomes are not very inspiring. So that's a general story, general kind of background of the whole thing. So once we understood that there is not much of the statistics to help us. So, and that each and all of you are kind of on your own. And in that sense, when we talk about the first generation, what does it mean? It actually means that, okay, you get the diagnosis, and that makes the medical specialist quite happy. Because once you get the diagnosis, well, it's sort of, you get, especially if the person is, has big enough ego, right? So you see, they're going to, might even get a chance to call it after themselves, right? So you see, like this, whatever, Rosa A. Dorfman or Towns Brooks or Wilson Riordan Kavanagh. So you see, these guys can get immortalized. And of course, if the condition gets identified like this, so then you have to understand that that's kind of establishes and opens a big program for studies, right? So you see, because the first thing that has to happen about any disease is to accumulate the so-called natural history. So natural history is basically how you should classify the cases which get this condition and what kind of outcomes happen to them more or less naturally during their lifetime. Like, what would be the worst outcome, what would be the best outcome, how often do they happen, like how they respond to some therapies and so on. But even before you can talk about the response to therapies, you have to establish the natural history, because without the natural history, how could you know how well the actual therapies are working, right? So that's the first point. So that's why you have to realize that for most of you, if you take the realistic time frame, right? So the year 2000, that's when the whole thing has been, the human genome was deciphered. So now we're in 2021. So basically, you are still in the first generation. So it's still the period of the natural history collection. Now, what does it mean? That from the perspective of humanity and mankind and science, I know, half a century or a century, that's not such a big deal, right? So you see, if we look at it from that kind of like general overall evolution of science and medicine perspective. So, the first generations will get the natural history. The second generation is going to get to know, okay, what happens if we try different treatments over these natural histories. The third generation might get it better. So that's kind of how it goes. But then, by the time this clock ticks, probably, that's not in our lifetimes, right? So that's why we have to think about the approaches which are going to be working today, and we have to sort of start thinking in a format which would be reliable and give us the reliable approach, reliable uh, dynamics of improvements and the transformation outside of this kind of super narrow scope of the particular condition. So that's really the thing, because when it comes to the specifics, you have to understand that, like, you are not in that, in you are so far a pioneer, right? So you see, in that sense, the standard medical model cannot really help you much. So that's kind of the first basic conclusion. So once we understood this first basic conclusion, let me see what else I have brought here. Okay, emerging rare genetic and genomic syndromes in autism and developmental delay, edited by Professor and Dr. Tech. What do they say? So they try to find the serious molecular autism. So now, are these people going to be, they are, like, you see, one is a professor, the other is the doctor, and so on. You see, these are the people who are happy to study molecular basis of autism and, let's say, study all the other thing and so on, and talk about the atypical biology and so on and so forth. So does it have any clinical relevance? No. Is it going to change how your everyday life goes with your child? No. So are they going to discover some miracle drugs? Highly unlikely. Like the chances are, I know, like 1 in a billion. So no better than winning the lottery. So they're just, but they are set for life. These people, they have their clean path. They be this, as a researcher, they can, publish articles, they can get grants, they can score whatever Hirsch indices of their being citations and all these other things. So basically, for the researcher who discovers something or who kind of jumps on this genetic horse, that's a good academic life. Because in that sense, you have the at least, let's say 2-3 generations of work clearly outlined in front of you. So you just do it and do it and do it, and well, whatever how it affects the individual life right now, that doesn't really, that's outside of scope of their work. So, and we look at the further ones, and I just took some basic ones, right? Okay, scientists discover new genetic disease that delays brain development in children, and it's a peer-reviewed publications. This disease causes some children's brains to develop abnormally, resulting in delayed intellectual development. This is new and doesn't have a name yet. And now they're trying to do the DNA and so on. Okay, so next generation of genome sequencing is transforming our ability to make new diagnoses and discover new causes for rare diseases, right? Again, when you read something like this, you say, wow, great job. But then you have to move to this article here and understand that's already a list of more than 4,000 genes and 6,500 diseases. So in reality, 10 years later, we would read the similar article. The numbers will probably double. Is it going to change anything in terms of the treatment and the everyday rehabilitation? Most unlikely, right? Because as you can see, these people are happy to study their frogs, happy to study their things. That's why this poor, you see this frog is actually Xenopus. Yeah, that's a frog finishing its metamorphosis, right? So you see, that's why they are happy to do their lab research, but you have to realize that that lab research is not going to bring any effects and make no difference in your life. So what else did I found? Okay, so that's scientists unravel a mystery of rare genetic disorder that causes intellectual disability in females, right? Again, sounds exciting. Unravel the mystery. If you start looking at this, okay, DGX3X Syndrome, as the condition is now known, was first described in 2015 study, in which scientists sequenced the genomes of thousands of participants. So that's how all these things are done, right? And here is the quote, which pretty much confirms what I just said, right? If you look back just 10 years, the cause of the vast majority of these cases were unknown, right? So you see what basically it tells us that the numbers of the children with developmental disabilities, they are sort of more or less the same. They didn't change that much, right? Of course, there are kind of things related maybe to the better survival rate of the premature children and so on, but the numbers, they didn't change that much. But what happened like 25, 30 years ago when I came into the rehabilitation field, what we had this very general label. That was the label of the so-called general developmental delay. That was it. So that was the group under which you had everything which didn't fit into their obvious brain injury, and then into the obvious things like Rett syndrome, Down syndrome, and the alike. That's it. So, but if you ask me, like now, 20 years later, there are like 6,000 labels, 6,000 new diseases identified. But if I look at the practical interactions, what the actual physical therapists, orthopedic surgeons, neurologists, and so on, what are they doing in the everyday life? Same things. Nothing, absolutely nothing has changed. And these guys with all sorts of these university positions, big laboratories and so on, they talk this kind of excited talk, unravel their mysteries, right? Now, this unraveling on this mystery, so you see this is DGX3X, right? And this person is asking me about the condition which, what was the first one? Now it's STXBP1 instead of the DGX3 whatever, right? So, so that's what I want you to understand, that when you get this new diagnosis, you see, it's kind of good from the social standpoint. Because in the past, like even maybe, I don't know, 15 years ago, 10 even years ago, a lot of families with those general developmental delays, it took them long time to receive like disability allowances, support and so on, because if the child is just general developmental delay, well, maybe he's going to outgrow it, right? So you see, especially if it's not something dramatically, immediately disabling, right? So then a lot of parents, that I met, they were really in this kind of high distress, that there was obviously something like not right with the child's development, but they're being squeezed into the standard forms of whatever, kindergartens or whatever, or they don't know what to do, they don't know where to go, and so on. They don't get the child's kind of this disability benefits and so on. So from that standpoint, this new diagnosis, that's actually a plus, because that gives every child in this condition a diagnosis either right now, or there is a kind of legit expectation that this diagnosis is going to come very soon. So, and that's why from the perspective of the social support and getting their disability status and allowances and so on, and actually kind of clarifying the situation, and also removing maybe this kind of additional false hopes, or maybe what is wrong with my child, like I don't know, is it something wrong with me, or is it like let's go to the psychologist, let's go to this. So there was a lot of confusion. So with this new diagnosis, the situation is cleaner. I mean, that's that much I appreciate about it. But overall, in terms of the rehabilitation, in terms of the practical things, nothing has changed. So that's the first conclusion that has to be made. So that's why when I would answer this first question here, so look, this label is important for your social standing. It's probably important for the, for the mankind in general in their next century perspective. But for you personally, it makes no difference whatsoever in terms of like how you would go about the development of your child, and what you would want to do to maximize and facilitate his progress and his like chances of getting the best quality of life. Well, as always, it took me some time to arrive to this sort of obvious conclusion, but well, I felt that at least we have to do justice and get some references and observations. So because usually I just kind of say this, guys, you know, like it's you are at the frontiers, and then we move on to the practical side, right? But like this is just to back it up and for you to understand where you are, right? So that you don't have any illusions in that sense. And again, it's a kind of position which you know, some people dislike it, but some people, they find it actually empowering, that you know, you don't rely on anybody, but you have to figure things, you know, have to figure things out yourself and kind of trust more to your sort of parenting intelligence, parental gut feeling, right? And your parental healing capacity and the healing power. So that's kind of thing. So once we understood this, the next logical question is that how are we going to go about the whole thing? And that's why we are then moving to, as we move towards the practical side, once we understood that the majority of the cases which are affected by the rare genetic diseases, as we have seen, 90% of those cases have some sort of the neurological impairment, some sort of the damage to the central nervous system. So that makes them obviously similar to a great extent to their cerebral palsy, to the consequences of the brain injuries. And that's the thing that we are going to discuss further, right? So that in that sense, what are the typical similarities and what are the typical differences between the two? Because in reality, when it comes to the rehabilitation process, and that's what I was saying in the video, we have to understand that by numbers, right? By numbers, rare diseases are something which goes up to at maximum 5 cases per 10,000, right? So, and most of them are much lower, like 1 per 10,000 or maybe 1 per 100,000, right? But brain injury, statistically, it's somewhere around, let's say, 50 cases per 10,000, right? So like it's 0.5% of the population. So instead of the 5, it's 50, right? So of course, there is lots of different conditions. So the overall numbers of the genetic conditions are similar nowadays to the cerebral palsy altogether, but individually, they're all much less than that. Why is that important? Well, for a simple reason that we have to understand how the rehabilitation systems are made. What are the standard expectations? How their therapists, doctors, social workers, and so on, and teachers, and so on. So what are the standard expectations? What, when they see a child with a disability, what do they expect to see? What do they expect to see as kind of, you know, the correspondence between the intellectual, physical, motivational, emotional, and all these levels, right? So what kind of presentation they make. And also that's what establishes their general expectations about their way, how different parts of the body respond to the treatments. So, and these are the two main things that we would want to discuss today. So, you know, my drawing skills are notoriously poor, so I have just made this super simple graphs, right? And well, I'll start with this. Visibility, good. Okay, so it's a super simple graph which has 3 parts. So it's very important to see that here we are observing this total scenario, right? So you see that what the medical condition is, medical science's interest is in this particular part, is a description of a disease. That's molecular level, that's specific genetic markers, that's specific location in the chromosomes, specific statistics and so on and so on. That's molecular level of the diagnosis, and molecular level of diagnosis gives you the maximum specifics. So in that sense, what they want to do and what they're trying to do, they're trying to slice it in as precise and as specific of the molecular definition as possible. So that's what they're doing, right? Because what is their hope and expectation? What is a big medical science? Big medical science is the hope of some either genetic engineering or some sort of molecular drug. That's what they are hoping for, right? Again, how realistic is that? Nobody knows. And as we see with even such a simple thing as COVID, the whole world came to a disaster. So, and basically, you can probably expect that, like, it's realistic to say, not in your lifetime. It's not molecular treatments or genetic engineering of anything like reliable and practical is not going to happen in the I don't know how many decades and generations. So, but this is what these people are working for. So that's what they're proud of, and that's how they keep slicing it more and more. That's a disease. Our focus point, right, is to say, okay, but what is more practical? More practical is to group those things into the way how those diseases, which are in thousands, bring some much larger groups of the developmental disorders. So that's kind of a group and the combination of challenges that the children experience, right? So, for example, if those are difficulties in respiration, that's one group of the developmental disorders, right? If there are difficulties of the digestions, there could be lots of different diseases, but as a group of the kind of life troubles is going to be another group, right? So you see where they all come together. So if it's the group which has troubles with the particular, like disconnection of the hands, that's a third group, right? So you see, if this is the one which has a particular disconnection of, say, hip joints and flatness of the pelvis, that would be another group, right? If this is a case where you have more a tendency to, for example, either, let's say, super sensitive skin overall, right? So you see, that's also going to be a developmental disorder of sorts. And then we can also group it, okay, but what about their emotional type of the responses, right? What about their level of their, let's say, external intellectual capacities? What about their global development, the global movement capacities, the specific motor capacities, then the more general things, right? The ability to sit independently, get the control of the head and so on. So this is where we start getting closer to the same classifications which are present in the brain injury department, right? So you see mildly affected children and more affected children. So children who are more, let's say, socially integrated and the ones who are less socially integrated. So this kind of thing. But my point is that all of these people are missing the most fundamental thing, that effectively even this grouping into the developmental disorders, which is still kind of a problem-based way of looking at it, is based on the fact that we are dealing with their development. We are dealing with life. And this life somehow works. This life, so basically, despite the troubles, despite the challenges, despite the need for the support, which might be there even such big things as a respiratory support or digestive support, or kind of getting the liquids in or whatever, right? So you see, or kind of uh, just buffering the epileptic seizures and so on. So despite those particular kind of vulnerabilities, the big picture, then the same way as they say 90% of it affects the central nervous system, my big point is that life goes on. There is this engine of life that is working, and this is something that we have to really appreciate. So the engine of life, it periodically stumbles, it works on their kind of not the most economical gear, it has trouble with switching gearboxes and so on, but this engine of life works. Your children are not on life support. There is, the basic metabolic processes, the basic growth processes, the basic evolution processes are happening there. So, and that's why this is what we really want to start. So we want to start with this basis. We want, and you see here, I put it into kind of gray area or black area, right? So you see then kind of bluish disorders, but the green is that engine of life, right? So you see that development works with problems, with issues, but fundamentally it works. So in that sense, this massive kind of super intelligence, the integrity of the system, the quality of the internal decisions is the one which belongs to the system itself. Why is it so important? It's important exactly for the same reason that it works for the brain injury as well, right? So you see, with the brain injury, we have the specific descriptions of the brain injury, where the exact location, what the MRI is telling us, that would be the disease and the condition. Then from those very narrow definitions, we move to the broader ones. What kind of disorder is that? But the main point that we want to make is not to over focus on this link from the disease to the disorder. But what we want to change the perspective and say, hey, the thing is that this is working, this is generally working, this is life, and we don't know how to create life. So that's why, as the general kind of information, the general control, this brain, this metabolism, this kind of system is working. And that means that what we need to do, we need to help this system to work better. We are not there to hack it as trying to genetic engineer it. We're not there to fix it because we don't even know how it works. We are there to help it. That's the basic point, right? So in that sense, the question which is sort of implied in this one which was asked by Aniko, right? So you see, like, okay, how could ABR cover everything related to the different kinds of conditions and different kinds of problems? So the answer is exactly that once we hook ourselves into this key process of the life and development, and we are looking for the things that we can help with there, right? Let's put it simple. We look at the way how the child is developing, right? And we say, okay, look, we see some challenges with the respiratory system, but it's working. So let's look at what's there. Let's look at what's there, like how we can make it better, right? So you see, let's zoom in and see, well, is this the strongest possible, or is the best possible coordination that comes from the diaphragm? Well, and if we see, oh, this is the situation when there is an overuse of the abdominal engagement and so on, so that kind of tells us that there are some compensations there, right? So, and that's what I'm trying to elaborate on this next view here, right? So, yeah, like this, right? So, when we talk about the action compensations, which look as disorders, right? So you see disorders. So behind those disorders are tonic adaptations, and behind them there is level of the deep tone control competences that we want to see. But I will elaborate on this, right? So disorders is what I've been showing here as the mid-level, right? So that's the critical thing. So once we start looking at the disorders not as the reflections of the diseases, but once we look at the whole thing from the perspective of life and say, hey, these are not disorders as reflections of the disease, these are the adaptations that the system has, because it's not very precise, right? So it's like, okay, if like in your car, you get only half of the gears working. Your car generally works, but it's not going to be the safest and the best driving, right? And you know, like yesterday, I mean, one of the sports sites sort of like on my phone just dropped and say celebrate, and I don't know, like some kind of miraculous race by Michael Schumacher, who had it like 25 years ago when he had to do 50 laps on just using just the fifth gear. So it's a miraculous race because he was using the fifth gear and nothing else, right? So it's, instead of having it from, I know, 1 to 10 as the Formula One driving allows, right? So that means that he had to compensate it with steering, he has to compensate it with gas pedal, with brakes pedal, with whatever. It wasn't easy, but those were the action compensation. So if we were to look at him from the disorders perspective, that was a disorder, right? And then he was overusing the gas, overusing that, and so on. But he was adapting to the situation. So, and that's the positive way of looking into it and saying, you know, life is working. So the body has its intelligence, the body has some difficulties and deficiencies that it's facing. So that's why it has to do certain things like spend more energy, use a different kind of fuel, and so on. And if you look at some kind of images, like, I don't know, from say the past wars era, right? You can find all sorts of the most like strange devices and the more strange engines, like the cars which ran on wood, you know, not on gasoline, you know, not on diesel, but on burning the wood, right? Is this the best way of running the car? Probably not, right? But as long as you have some process of energy transformation, so it could be made to work. Of course, it would like lose the competition if you were to compare it with the proper, you know, like, proper gasoline or whatever electric car, right? Well, I mean, electric is a little bit different there, but even electric cars 100 years ago, there were all sorts of things, right? There were like 20 different types of the, you know, of the batteries, and the way that they would be run, and the way how they got the electricity, and so that's exactly the situation here. And of course, if you have the luxury resources, if you have, you know, like the engine, and if you have a steady supply of high octane gasoline and so on, well, you know, you're not, you know, a, a mechanism that works using some burning the wood looks strange, looks like a disorder, but the key point, it's working. So, and that's the line that I'm kind of trying to break. That's the line that I'm trying to bring, is that if we look at the whole thing and say, you know what, okay, so if we see that the thing is working, the child is able to deliver the basic breathing, the child is able to maintain the basic oxygen exchange and so on. So, but does it with the excessive engagement of the abdominal wall, which doesn't facilitate well enough the development of the pelvic cavity. So, or does it with the excessive recruitment of the arm muscles, which are being used to stretch the rib cage to get a big enough breath, right? Or when the child is using so the arm muscles to supplement the weak neck in supporting the head. These are working systems. These are ingenious solutions that the brain is coming up with to deal with the shortages, to deal with the limitations. But these solutions are expensive. So they are not the most precise and they are expensive. So, and that's where, I'm bringing this graph where I talk about this tonic adaptation, so that when it comes to normal life, what is the basics of our normal life is that muscles are only doing 5% of the work. This is well-known official statistics. When you are walking, when you are lying down, when you are sitting, you are using about the same percentage of muscle effort. It's about 5%, between 3 to 8% to be precise, right? So 95% of everything, of all the function, are based not on the muscle effort, not based on the concentrations of forces. They are based on their distributions and the tonic adaptations. And what is spasticity? Spasticity, for example, is the situation when the child is in that position when there is not enough of those tonic competences. So, and the simple example that I always bring for these tonic competences is, for example, this. So let's look at the hip joint. Everybody knows about the hip, so at least that's the best known joint. So I give this simple example. So if we compare the, like the tonic competence of the paper with the tonic competence of the rubber glove. So you see, look, this is the rubber glove, right? So now let's think about it from the perspective of the hip joint. The hip joint, you need to turn all the way inwardly, and then turn all the way outwardly, right? So it's the internal rotation, external rotation. But you have seen that the joint capsule there and the ligaments, they're all kind of crisscrossed. Why is that? Because you need to control their torsion. Torsion is the most dangerous, the most surprising, and the internal force that is able to create the greatest concentrations, so it can create the greatest damages. So that's why you want to control it. And when it comes to the tonic competences, what do you want to control? You want to control the tension, the length, and the sensors which kind of telling you what is this relationship, right? Again, the simple example, your foot on your brakes. You want your brakes to be responsive, right? So you see that small press, you press a little bit, you feel that your brakes are gripping. That's tension, right? That you experience through the springs there. That's length, how far it goes. And you are constantly monitoring it, so it's the sensors which are monitoring what's happening there. And if suddenly your brakes are stuck, so you're trying to press hard but they don't go, your sensors, well, it's an alarm, right? Or if the situation you are trying to press the brakes and suddenly just whoop goes off, so for the same the length increases but the tension does not, right? So you have troubles. Your sensors start sending an alarm. So that's why if we look at this kind of rubber item, what's happening there, I'm doing the turning. You see, as I'm turning it all the way in, you see this relationship between the tension and length becomes more controllable, right? That's all the way in. But then the next controllable position is when I'm going all the way out, rotating it all the way out. But look, here in between, it's all loose. I don't know this relationship. So I miss the tonic competences. And if I miss the tonic competences, then what the body does, like you with the malfunctioning brakes, you would pull the emergency brakes. So does the body. So the body works on the distribution of loads, muscles the emergency adaptations. So in that sense, when you look at the way how the entire hip joint is made, it's designed in such a way, and that's why it has all this kind of convolutions and crisscrosses, so it would work in such a way that even when you are in the middle, that you are able to receive the exact information of where the joint is. So there would be that the brakes at the joint capsules are working, and if the brakes at the joint capsules are working, then your muscles are relaxed. Then you don't need to switch on the muscles to fight for it, right? But if for whatever genetic condition, instead of this nice rubberish tension length, you've got the thing which is more paperish, so you're going to have different tension length relationship. You will still have to solve the same problem. You have a hip joint, and you're driving, you need to have the competence about the position. So, but material is poor. So that means that you have to find the ways how to compensate. So you have to change either the settings of the sensors, or you have to set some blocks which are going to prevent this joint from working, right? And you will build some bridges around it. So you have to find some other ways, because if this thing gets into the load, then it breaks, and then you get the injury, inflammation, and so on. So that's really the thing that I want you to understand very, very clearly. That when we move into the understanding of the things like the hip joints and so on, that whether it's the brain injury and the catastrophe of the delivery and birth and kind of, or in utero inflammation, kind of injury, whatever, injuries, diseases, conditions, and so on, or whether it's a genetic thing which affects how the factory works on a permanent basis, the outcome in that sense is similar. So what the living body, the developing body has to solve is a similar task. So that's why, as I'm sort of sharing this thing here, so you see, as I'm solving, as I'm showing this, so that's the point. So that's what I was trying to bring here. So in that case, if we were to observe the person driving the car which runs on wood, burning wood, right, and having a furnace, that would be a disorder, comparing to the ones who are running on diesel and gasoline. But you can only run on diesel and gasoline assuming that you have all the pistons working, all the kind of injector working, and then you have the sufficient network of gas stations which are going to refill it in the right moment and so on. But if you are not in the situation where there's basically metabolism doesn't give you the gasoline, you have to run on diesel. If you don't have diesel, you will have to do it on kerosene. If you don't have kerosene, you have to do it on I know, alcohol. If you can't do it on alcohol, you have to do it on something else. So that's, if we look at it from that perspective, it looks wrong, but it's adaptations. And in that sense, spasticity and so on, those would be the emergency brake adaptations to those deep distributive missing parts. So that's why what we are looking at, we're looking at this base. We're looking at this base. We look at the development of the tonic competences, which is a universal thing for everybody. And that's the thing that each of us, even when we are in a better or worse condition, each of us can benefit from improved tonic competences. Do I have a perfect hip joint? No. Does Manuel have a perfect hip joint? No. None of us, right? So there is always room for better tonic competences there, but it functions sort of in that sense. So you see the tonic adaptations that we need are small, but the general principle that when we want to develop the basic kind of health assets, they're essential. So that's about these tonic competences. So what is the tonic competences? This is where we look at all the distribution systems. See, once again, muscles are emergency brakes. Muscles are emergency organs. Muscles are the organs which are creating force concentrations. Everything about the so-called fascia is, and about this 95% of what makes your functions possible is about distributions. Skin, fat, ligaments, joint capsules. So retinacula, periosteum, like the whole long list of all the specific, participations of the connective tissue, they are all about the distributions. Muscles are the only ones that create concentrations. Muscles are the emergency organs. So when we see spasticity, rigidity, or on opposite, the disconnects, this is where we can see that this is that's a disruption in the system. What do we want to bring into it? We want to bring better competences, better distributions. So, and that's why, in that sense, we're always looking at the same thing. So we are taking it from the perspective of global, how can we make the life better? How we can make these basic life mechanisms better? From what's already, we take it as, okay, it's not broken, it's already working. See, it's a very important thing. If we see that it's already working, now our part, but it's using too much of the force concentrations. It uses too much of the resources. It's not running on the 5% of muscles and 95% of distributions. Your channel would be either switching off in the kind of hypertonic state and trying to run on zero to save energy, or when he is forced to do things, he is going to run on maybe 50-50. Or maybe if you talk about the very rigid or very spastic channel, maybe it will be 80% muscle effort and 20% distribution, instead of 5% muscles, 95% distribution. So that's basically it. Like what ABR is doing, we never fight, we never chase the individual muscles. We basically look at the child where he is now and saying, okay, these are the current adaptations. So we judge and study them specifically, how your child is doing things, whatever he is doing, how he's lying down, right? How he's sitting, how he's trying to do the transfers, how he's moving or not moving the parts, because we start all the way from the respiratory, from the first actions, right? What are the first engines of life? Respiration, digestion, and all the mechanics which are supporting them, right? So we start with that and saying, hey, if we want the very simple principle, the good life is the one when it's 595. That's the formula of the good life. If it's not 595, this life is hard. That's it. So if your channel runs on 50-50 instead of 595, it's still life. It's not disorder in that sense. It's not broken. It's still life. It's still working, but it's a much harder life, right? It's much more expensive life. It's kind of life which kind of wears and tears you down when you don't get the resources and the proper distribution and so on. So it's much more expensive life. And that's why as the body grows, as the demands increase, you might simply run out of resources, right? So, in that sense, if your house has, big holes and so on and so forth, and you can't fix it, and you just have to burn more coal or more wood, right? And if it gets one cold winter, you just not going to have enough of it, like this year in Texas, right, or something like this. So that's exactly the point. So it's a system which is not as robust, which is not able to handle crisis so well, and so on. So that's why we have, you know, the troubles with the recovery after injuries and diseases and so on and so forth. But the general principle is this: it's still life. It's still it's a living system. With that means that this living system is like infinitely more intelligent than anything that we can so far invent with engineering. So that's why we shouldn't try to hack it. We shouldn't try to kind of say, oh, we are going to fix it. You know, you haven't done it, you don't know how to fix it if you are not the one who kind of designed it in first place, right? So we have problems fixing, you know, computer bugs, which are like millions of times simpler. So everyone who has, you know, whatever, Windows, Facebooks, whatever, so these things crash and do stupid things all the time, and they just have millions of lines of code. And human, if you translated the living system, have trillions of lines of codes and so on, and somehow they self-regulate. So, you know, and we don't know who wrote it and how to begin with. So we have to be more humble in that sense. And as I said, it's a very simple formula. So, you know, logic is very simple. So we have 50-50, it's already a hard life. So what do we want? We don't want to say, hey, you know, you need to do more. No. You know, our first task is to, okay, let's take the child where he is, starting with the basics, starting with how he performs in the horizontal position, everyday things, how well he's like his breathing mechanics is working, his head control mechanics is working, his distribution between the ventral and the dorsal, you know, and so on, before we get the ambitious goals. So you see, we have to get better in 595, because you see, if your child is running on 50-50 when lying down, when we're doing respiration, trying to get him into standing is ridiculous, because he's going to suddenly run on 90-10 instead of 50-50, and that's just going to be pure destruction. So start by building more, you know, like, and 595s, meaning that if we get from 50-50 to 40-60, we're reducing the negatives. If we move to 30-70, we're doing really well. So the channel has spare resources, there is ability to start fixing the internal holes and so on and so forth. So that's the development. And that's a universal principle, which is the same for both the you know, for both kinds of the developmental situations, whether it's a brain injury or whether it's a genetic conditions. So, and in that sense, that's kind of my main point. So that's what we're looking at, right? And you know, one other way to look at it is that instead of the disorder and disease, you know, there are specifics and the individualities of every child. But what we are looking then, unlike medicine, we are looking at the similarities of life, right? So similarities of solutions, let's put it like this, simulations of solutions to challenges. And we look at the commonalities of life. So commonalities of life processes, right? So you see, that's what we're looking at. So, and we start with the most fundamental ones. So that's the reason why we make these claims, which are sort of sounding like bullshitty or charlatanish from the medical perspective. When you say, well, you know, it doesn't matter for us what kind of specific disorder, which is it as CHFD or 1XT, or whether it's DGX3X, which out of the 6,500 is that? Because they look at it and they are proud of identifying those specific peaks and ticks and so on. You know, from our perspective, there is a commonality between all of them. It's life that is running, but that's life which is running on some kind of overdrive and some super effort, and it has to solve some challenges of the troubles with the disconnects and the you know, and the disruptions in the distributions. So, and what we universally looking at is how to help those. So we have the tools of how to take their, basically we look at the hip joint and say, hey, if this hip joint is too weak, we need to start delivering the kind of immersion and the stimulation to this joint capsule, to this ligament and so on. So these guys will get their pure feed and would be able to respond and start kind of remodeling and rebuilding themselves. So in order to develop those tonic competences, right? So you see, we talk about that so that you can control your tension length, your tension length sensor increments without the surprises, that you are able to handle the torsion, you are able to let's say the sudden, jerks and so on and so on. So that's what the whole thing is about. So, but now, of course, by the time that I said all that, you might say, oh, but does it mean that there is exactly the same thing when it comes to there's no differences between their genetic conditions and the cerebral palsy? So there are differences, but these differences are in the way how this kind of classes of the tonic adaptations happen. So in fact, it's actually quite simple to understand. So when you look at the situation with the children with cerebral palsy, so again, big solutions are the same, right? We still need to do, it's the big principle, 595, right? So it's, and the problem represents itself, let's say 40, 60, 60, 40, 70, 30, or whatever. Right, so you see, we always look for moving the situation, meeting it where it is, and moving it towards as close to 595 as possible. 5% muscles, or as little muscular contribution as possible, maximum distributions. Everything else, right? So distribute it and control it via the tone, not via the effort. So that's really the simple principle. And then the second point, which is kind of coming there, but if we look at the bodily map, so we have to understand it's tangible physical map, right? So you've got something like, I don't know, 600 muscles, 600 plus, right? You've got 200 plus bones. You have 400 plus joints. So, and what you have in cerebral palsy is a more kind of balanced or more even distribution. Meaning that in cerebral palsy, of course, you should know that you've got the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 types of the conditions, right? So you see where GMFCS level 1, GMFCS level 2, GMFCS level 3, GMFCS level 4, right? And the GMFCS level 5. So these are these conditions and the outcomes from the age of 2 to the age of 18. I'm not going to go into this. This is the basics that all of you should know, and you can find it easily online, right? So, but within each of those groups, it's a kind of more regular situation. For example, if the child is a level 3 child who is kind of in the wheelchair and so on, but you can expect that for that kind of condition of the torso, you could expect more or less predictable level of conditions of the arms, right? So we see, okay, so shoulder, elbow, wrist, fingers, they will be connected approximately at this level. And from this child, you could expect that he would have some reasonable manual competence, right? Or if it's a level 1 child, you could reliably expect that things are going to be more or less balanced as well, right? So you see maybe some, tone in the cuffs, maybe some challenges with, like dexterity and fine motor skills, but otherwise it's a reliable distribution, right? And it also refers to the social adaptations, to their, like eyes control and so on and so forth, right? And then, of course, if you take the level 5 child, then things would be problematic everywhere, right? So you could, like if you take a snapshot of the hand, you can more or less reconstruct the rest of the child. You say, or if that's the hand that looks like this, So then this belongs to the level 5 child. And that's very different in the children with the genetic disorders. They are much more diverse in this. So they are not that balanced. So what you can have the situation when you take a snapshot of the hand and the hand is completely disconnected. Just because for whatever reason there is a particular sport or the particular type of a protein or whatever which is kind of has a certain prevalence at the layout of the wrist which sort of doesn't shape very well, or because it's been important at the period of the wrist formation. And then you can have a wrist which is going to be disconnected to the level of the level 5 child. But at the same time, this same child might have a shoulder which would be, for example, of a level 3 child. So he will be trying to move the arms, he will be trying to push the elbow forwards and so on and so forth. So, and the opposite is also possible. Like, for example, the child is going to have a foot which is actually quite good, like sizable, connected foot and so on. But then you're going to have the hip joint, which is like just nothing, like complete wobble. And that child would actually want to kind of to find the ground with his foot. But then what is okay for the foot would be destructive for the hip. And that's because, you see, if you think about what's the nature of, say, sports injury, right? The nature of the sports injury is that the athlete always puts his kind of best foot forwards. He always runs on his strongest elements. But where is he injured? He's injured in his weakest elements, right? You see it, with footballers and so on. He kind of makes a sprint and then, and then, oh, my hamstring is gone, or my Achilles ruptured or something like this. Why? Because he accelerated the body with the muscles, like quadriceps or the gluteus and so on. So they were able to propel him forwards with the big force, but the decelerating capacities of the hamstrings were not enough. So boom, you've got a snap and you've got an injury which then destroys everything. So the same thing. You take the child sort of, and that's where there's a big confusion for the parents and the physical therapists. They look at his foot and say, oh, wow, okay, so this is the child who kind of looks more like a level 3 child. So they try to put him into the standing frame, they try to encourage him to do something else, but at the hip level, this child might be like a level 5 child. So putting him into this more strenuous and active activity and demanding activities will cause additional distraction to the hip joint. And the opposite could be also, like, it could be in the spine. Like you can have much stronger extremities in general, but then suddenly, like you have a disconnect at the spine, or particularly like super weak abdominal wall. So it's these irregularities that when it comes to the level 5, when the genetic condition, so you have this kind of very patchy thing. So you can have something which looks like even level 2, and then something like level 4, something like level 3, and so on. So and that is very, very confusing if you kind of get back to what I started my conversation with. I started my conversation saying, the base of rehabilitation comes from the brain injury and the cerebral palsy. So everybody kind of, if you talk about the physical therapist, if you talk about the kind of practical orthopedic diagnosis, the neurological diagnosis, the way how the schools work, the interpretation of their, focus and concentration, intellectual abilities, and so on. So they all come from that field. And that's why the genetic children could often get mistreated. So they're going to get either something way too intense, or, like on opposite, they could be overprotected and so on. So this is where you've got this thing. So finding the right kind of activity and the participation for them, and also getting, focusing on saying, oh, if that's the condition, we really have to, like we shouldn't be trying to milk our best, which we have from the level 2 and 3, but our priority has to be to patch the holes which are present at level, like at the most disconnected scenario. So that's exactly the situation that we're looking at. And like good example, when we started, you know, yeah, Senor Alonso, right? So a couple of years ago, they just was very, very, interesting case with the child with super disconnected wrists, right? So like really the kid who would be very, very active and so on with the level of the shoulders and so on, and very participant, but then the wrists were literally like chopped. And what was, but he tries with this kind of hand, he tries to, I know, pull the toys, assemble things, and the physical therapist kind of runs with that, and they try to stretch it and so on. But when you try to do this, you only destroy it further. So, and like in this couple of years, when we really got the strategy right, you can see that once we started zooming into those holes and patching them and so on, then the child shows remarkable progress, because then his strengths from the other levels, they get integrated, they get, they naturally pick up and get the ability to integrate. So that's more or less the situation. So I hope that in the usual 1.5 hours of kind of net talk, right, I kind of covered the bigger picture and has shown you the kind of key focus points, so that we approach everything from the life side, not from, from the commonalities, from the development, from what's in common, from recognizing that it's all about the mystery of life and the fact that the engine of life is running. And our job is not to try to hack it. Our job is to help as much as possible to get this engine of life running in the smoothest and easiest fashion. And the recipe for this is 595. Go for the feed the distribution system, feed the distribution structures, and get them to get the best possible transmissions, contributions, and so on. And then the body would happily switch off the excess kind of effort, the excess muscular and the excess kind of force concentration activity. So we don't need to fight with them. We just need to feed the distribution. So that's basically the main equation of the rehabilitation. So you feed the distributions, so and the excess efforts, excess problems, they start kind of cooling down by themselves. But as I said, there is a, that's a general principle, that's a general approach that is true both for cerebral palsy and for the genetic conditions in their entirety, right? So you see, for the entirety of the developmental disorders, including the autistic situations, which are kind of not even when they are not instantly or specifically diagnosed with major physical challenges, but they are exactly from the same, from the same field, right? So it's kind of just, it's more, when we talked here about the tonic competences, tension, length, and sensor accuracy, right? So you see, so in that sense, the genetic and the cerebral palsy situations, it's when it's more the tension length, right? And their autistic conditions, and when the main challenge is on the sensor accuracy side, right? So, but then we move into the big point, and we move into this thing that, yes, there are important differences between the developmental facilitation and help and rehabilitation of children with the cerebral palsy, brain injury, like, and the children with the genetic condition. So cerebral palsy is more uniform within the type. So whilst their genetic conditions are more like patchy, so it's a kind of more eclectic assembly with where you can have some super disconnects into the system, whether it's a skin gluing, whether it's their joint like really disruption, or whether it's like the super disconnect from the bone. So these are kind of the specifics which you need to identify, and unfortunately nobody, well, I mean, like, nobody studies this kind of specifics, right? Because that belongs to the level of the disorder, that belong to the level of the adaptations. It doesn't belong to the level of the molecular disease or molecular condition. So that's what we can do at the whole person. We do it in live evaluation of the living child, right? So you see, like, or the video and so on, doing the tests, not in the laboratory, right? This you can only find on the live human being. So I think that that's kind of our 1.5 hour mark, and I hope that that makes sense and kind of helps you in the general understanding. So, and I guess now we can move to the question and answers. So, and yeah, I hope that I kind of can say that I've answered this question, right? So you see in both ways, right? So I'll put this answer live done, right? So you see that no, whatever the label is behind it, whatever number of letters and particular abbreviations. So as we zoom into the commonalities and the index of life, so that's where we can help the situation. So now we move to the Q&A, right? So you see for the families, and we say bye bye to the people on Facebook and the other streams. So, and of course, well, if you find this interesting, so please sort of share these recordings with the families of the children who are in a similar situation. So it might be additional thing that would help them to understand where to go and how to sort this out, right? Because as I said in the beginning, you are in a kind of, you know, the same boat between the CP and the genetic conditions, and you're both there on the frontiers, right? So that's what you have to understand. So the better you understand, the better you kind of educate yourself, and more, you know, integrate is their overall understanding and the information. So the more it's going to help you with good decision making. All right. So all the best. Cheers. Bye bye.